Hi, so in this video, I'm going to tackle 10 questions that focus on the structure of arguments. They could be questions that are asking you to identify the conclusion, that are asking you to identify the role played by a particular claim or statement in the argument. They could be asking you for the method of reasoning. So how does the argument proceed? How is it structured as a whole? Or asking for you to identify an argument that has a similar structure or similar reasoning to the stimulus. All right, so if I can get my cursor back, let's go to prep test 64. Okay. Going to section 2 and question 25. Okay. So this one is asking for the role played by a contention. So what I like to do is highlight the part that they want us to kind of, relate to the rest of the argument in some way. I identify what part of the argument it is, and then highlight that same thing in the argument. So it's actually the first sentence. I do see that the word immediately following that sentence is however, which indicates that what comes later is in contrast to this claim. Okay, so that's kind of interesting to me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read the argument now. The town would not need to spend as much as it does on removing trash if all town residents sorted their household garbage. However, while telling residents that they must sort their garbage would get some of them to do so, many would resent the order and refuse to comply. Okay, so we have this like conditional statement, and then it kind of introduces this problem, right, of how much the town is spending to remove trash. And they wouldn't have to do that if all the town residents sorted their garbage. But if we tell them to do it, not all of them are going to do it. The current voluntary system then is to be preferred because it costs about as much as a non-voluntary system would, and it does not engender nearly as much resentment. So basically, they say, all right, well, we're going to propose some like potential alternative, which is a non-voluntary system, telling people that they have to sort their garbage. We're going to kind of do the thought experiment of that, but at the end of the day, the cost is going to be the same. And if we don't tell people what to do, they're not going to resent us so much. Okay, so this initial claim here is almost like provides the problem, I guess. So A, it's a claim that the editorial is trying to show is false. So no, they're not actually trying to say that it's false, that if everybody did this, then the town would spend less money. They're just saying that we can't force everybody to do it. Some people will refuse to do it if we tell them to. It's a fact granted by the editorial that lends some support to an alternative to the practice that the editorial defends as preferable. So, boy, we've got a lot of wordiness in this answer choice. So, is it a fact granted by the editorial? Yes, I believe it is. So they don't actually try to show that this is false or claim that this is false. They say, yeah, if everybody did it, that would be great. Thing is we can't make everybody do it. So does it lend support to telling people to do it? I mean, kind of, right? Because some of them will do it, right? And then that would be good, but all of them won't. And so overall, it doesn't really make sense to change to that practice. So Yeah, I do think it lends some support to an alternative to the practice that the editorial defends as preferable, which is the current voluntary system. It lends a little bit of support to an involuntary system where we tell residents what to do. C, it's an example of a difficulty facing the claim that the editorial is attempting to refute. I don't believe so. It's not really an example of a difficulty. It's actually just a conditional relationship. It's a premise the editorial's argument relies on in reaching its conclusion. So no, they don't actually rely on it in reaching their conclusion, right? Their conclusion is that we should just keep things the way that they are. So it doesn't need to be true that if we did something differently, that the town wouldn't need to spend as much money in order for the argument to reach the conclusion that we should stay with a non-voluntary or stay with a voluntary system. It's the conclusion. No, the conclusion is that the current voluntary system is to be preferred. That's their conclusion. Okay, so we end up with B. So hopefully that helps a little bit for you to understand that one. Okay, we'll go on to another structure question, 66, section 2, question 16. Okay. So here we're looking for similar reasoning. So we want to find the structure of this argument and then an argument with similar structure. So I like to look for the conclusion and the support and then sort of try to say in my own words how the argument proceeds. So the owners of uptown apartments are leaning toward not improving the apartment complex. They believe that the increased rents they could charge for improved apartments wouldn't cover the cost of the improvements. So, yeah, okay. So overall, it's not going to cover it. So the increased rents isn't going to cover it. So that is not going to cover the costs. So they're not going to like break even is sort of what they're saying, but they're just looking at increased rents. But the improvements would make the surrounding housing, which they also own, more valuable and rentable for higher rents. So the owner should make the improvements. So they're saying, okay, we're not gonna do this because we don't think that we're going to break even. And then the reasoning in this argument here is, okay, yeah, but you're just looking at one factor. You should look at more factors that are going to kind of like bring you a benefit, bring in money. And then they ultimately do come to a conclusion that they should make the improvements. So there's sort of this like cost benefit analysis. And the author of the argument here is saying, here are some benefits you haven't considered. Therefore, you should do something other than the thing that you're leaning toward. All right, so John's injured knee doesn't cause him a lot of pain. So he doesn't want to undergo the pain of surgery to heal it. But the surgery would enable him to exercise regularly again. Thus, John should have the surgery. Okay, so I can see this one matching a bit, right? So John doesn't think that it's worth it to have the surgery, just like the owners of these uptown apartments don't think it's worth it to improve the apartment complex. In his own risk benefit analysis or cost benefit analysis, John has decided that there isn't enough of a benefit. But the author of the argument brings up another benefit that John hasn't thought of, and concludes that John should do something like the opposite of what he wants to do. So I do think that there's fairly similar reasoning in A. And if I were under a lot of time pressure, which of course you are when you're writing the LSAT, and I found an answer like A for a parallel reasoning question, and A looked really good to me, I would actually choose A and move on just to save myself some time. And think, yeah, like it's similar enough that like that's probably the right answer. I'm probably not going to find one that's more similar. But I could. And when we're practicing, we want to go through all of the answer choices. Okay. So, or at least when we're practicing untimed, right? Okay. So B, since it's fishing season lasts only 6 months, Lake Town Fishing Company prefers renting boats to buying its own. But since boats can be used for other purposes during the fishing season, it has made the wrong decision. So this is, yeah, not quite the same. So this is a company that rents boats, or yeah, a fishing company that rents boats. And this idea here that it could be used during for other purposes during the fishing season, it doesn't make quite as much sense, because they're talking to a fishing company. Is that something that a fishing company is really going to care about? Whereas with the apartment complex, like, yeah, they are going to care. They care about the money. That's what they're making the decision on. With John and his injured knee, like he cares about the costs of doing the surgery versus the benefits of doing the surgery, and being able to exercise regularly again would be a benefit of the surgery that would be relevant to John. I think that's like fairly fairly common sense that would matter to him. Whereas with a fishing company, I think it's fairly common sense to recognize that like they are using the boats for fishing, and so to say that they could use them for other things doesn't really make a lot of sense for a fishing company. So I'm going to eliminate B. C, Max's mechanic thinks there's a crack in the left cylinder head of Max's car and wants to remove the engine to check. The diagnostic engine removal would cost about $175, even if the cylinder head does not need replacement. But if it's cracked and does not replace, the engine will be ruined. So Max should have the mechanic check for the crack. So here we don't have Max like having an opinion, right? Like leaning toward something, and then we say, okay, well, he's actually ignoring a benefit that he hasn't taken into account. So this one isn't really structured similar to the original. Because of dental problems, Leona cut her consumption of candy. Consequently, she learned to enjoy fruit more. Thus, dental problems, which can lead to other health problems, led in her case to an improved diet and better health overall. Yeah, so this really is not similar at all to the reasoning. This isn't about Leona making a decision and she's leaning one way, and then we come up with a benefit that tells her to go another way. So this is, yeah, really dissimilar. E, bulk fruit company is deciding whether to market a new hybrid fruit. Okay, great. So this, we've got a decision being made. So we want to know, what does bulk fruit company, what are they leaning toward? Why are they leaning toward that? And then we want to say, okay, well, here's something you haven't thought of that would make you or should make you lean in the other direction. Bulk fruit company is deciding whether to market a new hybrid fruit. It is enthusiastic about the idea. Okay, so leaning towards doing it, since research suggests that people will come to like this fruit. Okay, cool. Therefore, it is in the long-term interest of the company to market the hybrid fruit. All right, so here the writer of the argument actually is siding with what the decider already wants to do, and that's not similar to the original. So I would eliminate that, and overall I think A is the most similar for sure. Yeah, hope that helps. Let's find the next one. So 66, section 2, question 25. So same section, question 25. And we are trying to describe an argumentative technique used. So the method of reasoning. When a group is unable to reach a consensus, group members are often accused of being stubborn, bullheaded, or unyielding. Such epithets often seem abusive, are difficult to prove, and rarely help the group reach a resolution. Those who wish to make such an accusation stick, however, should choose unyielding, because one can always appeal to the fact that the accused has not yielded. Obviously, if one acknowledges that a person has not yielded, then one cannot deny that that person is unyielding, at least on this issue. Okay, so yeah, overall they're saying we probably shouldn't go accusing people of being stubborn, bullheaded, or unyielding. They give a lot of reasons why we shouldn't do that. However, if you do want to, those who wish to do this, if you're going to do this, then, go with unyielding rather than stubborn or bullheaded, because with unyielding, you're actually going to be able to prove it, right? One of the things that they say about those accusations is that they're difficult to prove, but at least with unyielding, you're able to appeal to the fact that the accused has not yielded. So you're able to appeal to some evidence that you have in front of you, which is that, clearly you haven't yielded because the group hasn't been able to reach a consensus, right? You haven't compromised, you haven't allowed the other person to have their way, and so you haven't yielded. Yeah, they're kind of just going based on the pure meaning of the word. Yeah, all right, let's see. So A, are they rejecting a tactic on the grounds that it constitutes an attack on the character of a person and has no substance in fact? No, they're not actually. And they're saying that you could actually make this accusation stick because it does have substance in fact. You can appeal to the fact that they haven't yielded. So that's not the case. Rejecting a tactic on the grounds that the tactic makes it virtually impossible for the group to reach a consensus on the issue in question. So they never say it makes it virtually impossible for them to reach a consensus. It does say that such epithets rarely help a group reach a resolution, but they go on to kind of promote using the accusation of unyielding. If you really do want to go ahead and say something like this, then this is the way to go. So overall, I would be a bit hesitant to say that their argumentative technique is to just reject a tactic. Yeah, so they do say that these tactics rarely help the group to reach a resolution, which is sort of related to making it impossible to reach a consensus. But it's too they're specific and just kind of sticking with the initial statements, when I think the bulk of this person's argument is in what they think about choosing unyielding. All right. Conditionally advocating a tactic on the grounds that it results in an accusation that is less offensive than the alternatives. So they're not saying that you should use it because it's less offensive. They're saying you should use it because it's more defensible on the facts. So they don't focus on whether or not the person who is accused of being unyielding, how they feel about it, whether they feel offended or not. They're focusing on whether or not you can then say, well, I can prove that you are unyielding because, well, look at you. You haven't yielded, have you? You haven't reached a consensus. So yeah, they're not concerned with whether or not it's offensive to the person, but whether it's defensible by the person who's accusing. All right. Conditionally advocating a tactic on the grounds that it results in an argument that would help the group to reach a consensus. No, this is not going to help the group reach a consensus. It's just going to help you defend the fact that you called somebody unyielding. So it's got to be E. Conditionally advocating a tactic on the grounds that it results in an argument for which one could not consistently accept the premise but deny the conclusion. Okay, so can you accept the premise that you have not yielded and also deny the conclusion that you are unyielding? No. So that's what they're talking about here. They're talking about if you call someone unyielding, then you have this argument where if you acknowledge that you haven't yielded, you're accepting that premise, well, then you can't deny the conclusion of my argument, which is that you are unyielding. So that's what they're talking about in their argument. They're saying, I would be able to convince you that my accusation is true, basically. So E is the correct answer there. Okay. 68, section 3, question 22. Oh, sorry, question 20. 68, 320. Okay, another method of reasoning question. Given the human tendency to explore and colonize new areas, some people believe. So I highlight that because there's this pattern in a lot of logical reasoning arguments where they'll sort of say, some people say, some people argue, some people believe, some scientists contend, some anthropologists, some philosophers, right? It's like some group of people, could be a certain group of people, or, but it's like a subset of a group of people has an opinion. They've come to some kind of conclusion. And then the argument that our author is making, right, the scientist in this case, the scientist's argument, is often in contrast to that, but could be also just kind of bouncing off of that in some way that's not necessarily in direct conflict, but a response to what this other group of people think. So I just look at that as a structural component when I see that phrase, some people believe. Okay, so given the human tendency to explore and colonize new areas, some people believe that the galaxy will eventually be colonized by trillions of humans. If so, okay, so now we get into this sort of hypothetical thought experiment, conditional idea. If so, the vast majority of humans ever to live would be alive during this period of colonization. Since all of us are humans and we have no reason to think we are unrepresentative, the odds are overwhelming that we would be alive during this period too. Okay, very interesting. So this is an interesting sort of thought experiment, and trying to use like probabilistic sort of reasoning here. But it all starts off with if what those people believe is true, then we have all of this, they're kind of taking that to what they see as like its logical endpoint. And the logical endpoint they get to is that since all of us are humans and we have no reason to think we're unrepresentative, the odds are overwhelming that we would be alive in this period too. But because we are not alive in this period, the odds are slim that such colonization will ever happen. Okay. So they are going against what some people believe, right? And they're saying, okay, well, if what you think is true, then here's what would happen. That hasn't happened, therefore what you think is not true, right? So they're kind of doing a contrapositive. They're sort of reasoning by contrapositive here. Reasoning that because an event has not occurred, that event has a low probability of occurring. Not quite. That's too much of a simplification that actually ignores a part of the argument where there's this conditional aspect to it, where they do the, if this is the case, then we would expect this result. We don't have that result, therefore that's not the case. This just focuses on the end point, but that's not quite what it's based on, right? So this just focuses on the last sentence, not the whole argument, but just the conclusion part. So I would eliminate A. B, drawing a conclusion that implicitly contradicts one of the premises that the argument accepts. I don't actually see a contradiction here. If that's something that you did see in this argument and you chose B, then let me know. But this is one where I would say, no, I didn't actually see a contradiction between the conclusion and the premises. C, takes for granted that dependable predictions about the future cannot ever be made simply on the basis of the present facts. No, they actually make a prediction of their own. So they're not assuming that we can't make predictions because they predict that the odds are slim that such colonization will ever happen. They're not withholding judgment on that about the prediction. They come up with their own as well. D, inferring that since an event that is taken to be likely on a given hypothesis has not occurred, the hypothesis is probably false. Yeah, so I really like this one. So the event, which is the colonization of the rest of the galaxy, I guess, right? That they say that's likely, right, or that we would live during that time is likely based on the hypothesis. And since that hasn't occurred, right, we're not alive during that period, then the hypothesis is false, and the hypothesis that we will eventually colonize the rest of the galaxy is probably false. So the odds are slim that it will ever happen. So they also get the probability part right, where this is about likelihoods, right? It's not, the odds of this happening. Yeah, that's a positive thing about this answer choice as well. I really like this one. E, making a prediction far into the future based on established human tendencies. So again, they're not really basing it on just human nature and what humans are like. They're rejecting this hypothesis because the current situation doesn't match what we would expect based on that hypothesis. Right. Next one on my list is 70, section 2, question 17. All right, so we're looking again for the role played by a particular claim. Okay. So where does that occur in this sentence? It's actually the very last sentence in this paragraph. All right. A meteorologist says that heavy downpours are likely to become more frequent if Earth's atmosphere becomes significantly warmer. Now that looks to me like it's probably the conclusion. And I say that because it looks like a prediction, right? And I think probably the rest of this is going to tell us why they think that that's likely to be the case. I could be wrong, right? We can't always just find the conclusion based on the words within that sentence. It has to do with the relationship between that sentence and those ideas and the other ideas in the argument. So this prediction could be a premise if the next sentence is something that is supported by the prediction. But if the next sentence supports the prediction, then the prediction is the conclusion. Okay, so I'm going to reread that. Heavy downpours are likely to become more frequent if Earth's atmosphere becomes significantly warmer. A warm atmosphere heats the oceans, leading to faster evaporation, and the resulting water vapor forms rain clouds more quickly. Okay, so that sounds like they're explaining why warmer atmosphere leads to more frequent heavy downpours. A warmer atmosphere also holds more moisture, resulting in larger clouds. In general, as water vapor in larger clouds condenses, heavy downpours are more likely to result. Okay, great. So what we have here is we have a bunch of like stepping stones leading us to the conclusion, right? So we're trying to create a bridge between the Earth's atmosphere becoming significantly warmer and heavy downpours likely to become more frequent. So all of these things connect to each other. And that last sentence, all on its own, isn't really supporting the conclusion, right? Because that last sentence has to be connected all the way back to Earth's atmosphere becoming warmer in order for it to matter to the conclusion, because the conclusion is all about this condition of if Earth's atmosphere becomes significantly warmer. So certainly that statement supports the conclusion, but it does it with the other statements. So A, is it the conclusion? No, the conclusion is the first sentence. Is it the conclusion? Again, B, no. Is it a statement that the argument is intended to support, but is not the conclusion of the argument as a whole? So those other statements don't actually support this one, right? Like they are connected to each other to support the conclusion. But like the fact that a warmer atmosphere also holds more moisture, resulting in larger clouds, doesn't actually support the idea that as water vapor in larger clouds condenses, heavier downpours are more likely to result. Like they're connected to each other, right? We get, if we get more moisture, we get larger clouds. If we get larger clouds, then we get heavier downpours. Like they're connected, but just because one sentence is true doesn't prove the other sentence is true. It is used to support the only conclusion of the argument. It is used to support. It provides a causal explanation of the phenomenon described by the conclusion of the argument as a whole. So does it on its own provide a causal explanation? That I would actually take issue with, because this statement alone doesn't provide a causal explanation. It helps, like it's part of the puzzle, but it doesn't do it on its own. And then to say that it's not intended to provide support for the conclusion, it is intended to provide support. All three of these sentences together support the conclusion. So D is actually the best answer. Okay. All right. And I believe the next one is question 17. Yep, here. Okay, so we're looking for similar reasoning. All right, so let's find the conclusion in this stimulus in this argument and the support, and try to talk about the argument in our own words and find something that's similar. So we can be sure that at least some halogen lamps are well crafted because halogen lamps from most major manufacturers are on display at Furniture Labyrinth. Any item on display at Furniture Labyrinth is well crafted. Okay, great. So what we've got here is all the support. And then this is the conclusion. So, we're confident, but we're also using words to like qualify what we're talking about, right? So they are confident about some halogen lamps being well crafted. Why? Because they're halogen lamps at this store, and if something's at this store, it's well crafted, right? Okay, so let's see what we can get here. So if I look at the conclusion for these guys, we can be confident that the temperature will drop abruptly on at least one day this week, right? That seems to match. We can be positive there are at least a few disturbing sonnets. Okay. We can be sure that Gianna will get at least some good mechanical work done on her car. We can be positive that at least some minnows are healthy. We can be confident that the cornmeal used at Matteo's Trattoria is healthful and organic. So this one I would eliminate because we don't have at least some or synonymous language to that. So there's no parallel to that like qualifying phrase. So I would eliminate E. All right, let's keep going. Let's look at the evidence here. So 4, there is a chance of storms on most days this week. And whenever there are storms, the temperature drops suddenly. Okay, so here we have an issue because a chance of storms doesn't mean that those storms are actually going to happen, right? Whereas there are actually halogen lamps on display at Furniture Labyrinth, right? So this does not match in strength to the support for the original. Okay, and then we have this guy here. Sorry, that should be pink. That is parallel to because, right? Introducing the support. So Melinda has written several different kinds of sonnets. Everything Melinda writes is disturbing. This one actually works. This is perfect, right? We could substitute these like halogen lamps and Furniture Labyrinth into this one. So we could say we can be positive that there are at least a few well-crafted halogen lamps, given that Furniture Labyrinth has several kinds of halogen lamps on display. Everything Furniture Labyrinth has on display is well crafted. So the subject matter, we can just transpose it into B, and it's got an identical structure. The reasoning is the same. They're just using different words and, of course, different subject matter, but the actual kind of skeleton of the argument is identical. So B is the correct answer. Let's look at the other ones and see why they're wrong. So for C, why? Okay, so she can have her car worked on at any of several shops in the city, and every shop is capable of doing good mechanical work. So that's different from every shop does good mechanical work, right? Everything on display at Furniture Labyrinth is well crafted. The capacity to be well crafted or the capacity to do good mechanical work, that's a different issue from what we have in the stimulus. So the reality versus the capacity, right? Okay. D, we can be positive that at least some minnows are healthy because why? So because many different species of minnow can be found in lakes nearby, and every lake nearby is teeming with healthy fish. Okay, so every lake nearby is teeming with healthy fish, that's where we have our problem. So if every lake nearby had 100% healthy fish, right? Then yeah, okay, if we know that there are minnows in those lakes, we know those minnows are healthy, and therefore at least some minnows must be healthy. But to say that they're teeming with healthy fish isn't to say that every single fish in those lakes is healthy. So if we were to say that, every Furniture Labyrinth store has plenty of well-crafted items, we don't know that the halogen lamps that they have are included within that plenty of well-crafted items, right? That doesn't cover every single item. Just like here, it's not going to cover every single fish. You can eliminate D, and B is the correct answer. 77, 322, my next one. Okay, the claim that music is merely sound plays which one of the following roles? Okay, where does it say that music is merely sound? Here. What are the words around it? So the word for, likely we could replace that with the word because. So you can't always do that with the word for. It does play a few different roles in sentences grammatically, but in this one, it is introducing support. And therefore, okay, so it supports something over here, right? But then it's used to support something else as well, is what it looks like. Possibly the main conclusion. Okay, so let's see by actually reading the whole thing what we're dealing with. A theorist says that hatred and anger, grief and despair, love and joy are pairs of emotions that consist of the same core feeling and are indistinguishable from each other only in terms of the social conditions that cause them and the behavior they in turn cause. So even if the meaning of a given piece of music is the emotion it elicits, okay, so when they say even if this is true, they're conceding that fact, right? So they're conceding that the meaning of a given piece of music is the emotion it elicits. This can mean only that music produces the core of a given emotion. Okay, so this is a conclusion that they come to, right? That music just produces the core of a given emotion. Why? Well, because music is merely sound and therefore by itself creates neither social conditions nor human behavior. So this statement, music is merely sound, supports the idea that music doesn't create social conditions or human behavior, and that it doesn't create social conditions or human behavior is then support for the idea that music only produces the core of a given emotion rather than the specificity here, right? So music can produce something that is shared by hatred and anger, but they're saying you can't actually distinguish between hatred and anger without looking at the social conditions and the behavior. And so music can't be specific to anger, but the emotion that it produces would be something that is a core emotion that hatred and anger share, potentially, or it could produce something that grief and despair share, or love and joy. So the core feeling of those pairs rather than like one specific emotion. But yeah, based on the structure here, what we're seeing is this statement supporting a statement that then supports the main conclusion. right? And so it's not the only support for the main conclusion, and it's not really direct support for the main conclusion. It is support, and it goes along with this other kind of subsidiary conclusion, or like intermediate conclusion. Okay, so is it a generalization? It is a generalization, a particular instance of which is cited in the argument in order to undermine the viewpoint that the argument is attacking. Oh boy. So I'm not sure that I can point to a viewpoint the argument is attacking. So that is, yeah, not great. A generalization. I don't think there's a generalization and a particular instance. So, I mean, could describe the phrase "music is merely sound" as a generalization, potentially, but um, but yeah, I wouldn't say that there's like a particular instance of music being merely sound that they cite. So I don't like A. Is a portion of the conclusion. It's not a portion of the conclusion. It's support for the conclusion. It's a claim that's offered as partial support. I like this, right? I've said a few times that it's not the only support for the conclusion. It supports like a subsidiary premise, so that's good. It's a generalization, the truth of which is claimed to be necessary to establish the conclusion. So they don't actually say that we need music to be merely sound in order to get to the conclusion. So that's going too far. Is it a hypothesis that must be rejected? No, it supports the conclusion. Okay. All right, what do we have next? We have the same section, right? Yeah, 77, section 3, question 14. The proposition that certain entrepreneurs fail in managing company growth plays which one of the following roles? All right. Certain entrepreneurs fail. Where is this? Fail later. Okay, so that is interesting. Many entrepreneurs. So they fail later for lack of managerial skills, for instance. So this is a for instance, right? This is an example that they fail in managing company growth. So I have to be specific, identifying where the proposition actually is in the argument. That is important. And so that first one, it does talk about how they fail for lack of managerial skills, but then they actually go into a specific example where certain entrepreneurs fail at managing company growth, which is what the question stem is identifying as this like argument part we need to describe. So just a note to be careful there to make sure that you're correctly matching up those statements. All right. Obviously, entrepreneurial ability is needed to start a successful company. Okay, so they identify a necessary condition. Yet, contrast, right? Many entrepreneurs who succeed in starting a company fail later for lack of managerial skills. So great, you started it, but you can't maintain it. And they're saying that's because you don't have managerial skills. Okay, and then they give an example. Okay, an example of a lack of skills that results in failure. So, for instance, they do not adequately analyze market trends, and consequently, so because of that, then they fail in managing company growth. Hence, okay, so because of all this, so this here, this example is going to support the main conclusion. Hence, the lack of managerial skills and the lack of entrepreneurial ability can each inhibit the development of successful companies. So what the proposition, the proposition we care about, that is supporting the part of the conclusion that talks about a lack of managerial skills. They also, in the conclusion, mention a lack of entrepreneurial ability. That lack of entrepreneurial ability relates back to this statement here about entrepreneurial ability being needed to start a successful company. So they actually are dealing both with, can you start it and can you maintain it, and saying that lacking either one of these things. So we have support for like half of the conclusion with this example, and the example actually supports the statement that many entrepreneurs who succeed in starting a company fail later for lack of managerial skills, because it's an example of that. So we have another thing where we have support that is for a subsidiary conclusion. That subsidiary conclusion, along with this other statement, go on to support the main conclusion. So following those dots, connecting those dots, we can then see how this statement fits in. All right, so is it the main conclusion? No, the main conclusion is this last sentence here. It is presented as an example of the phenomenon the argument seeks to explain, but not actually really seeking to explain the phenomenon of failing for a lack of managerial skills. They are just saying that's one of the ways that you can fail in developing a successful company. So they're not really, like, the argument isn't directed at trying to explain this phenomenon. It is meant as an aside and not supposed to provide evidence. No, it definitely supports the conclusion. It's a premise that is intended to support the argument's main conclusion directly. Actually, it's not direct. So this is the part where we have to follow the dots and go, okay, well, like, this is an instance, an example that is offered to support this, not quite the main conclusion, but indirectly it supports the main conclusion because it supports another statement that supports the main conclusion. It's an example that's offered in support of a premise that is intended to support the argument's main conclusion directly. E. Yeah, so E is better than D here. All right, so we got 2 left. Going to prep test 79 now. 79. Okay, so I've got 79, section 3, question 12. Okay, so how does Young respond to West's argument? West says, of our company's 3 quality control inspectors, Haynes is clearly the worst. That's probably the conclusion. Likely West is now going to try to prove that Haynes is the worst. Of the appliances that were returned to us last year because of quality control defects, half were inspected by Haynes. All right. So, okay, so let's think about this, right? So we've got 3 quality control inspectors. And what we would expect is that if they're all equally good and they all inspect exactly 1/3 of the appliances, and it's at random, right? Like, we're not sending any one of them appliances that are more likely to have quality control defects or anything like that. Then we would expect that for each of the quality control inspectors, that 1/3 of the ones, or 1/3 of the appliances we get back because of defects would have been inspected by each of these quality control inspectors. So we kind of would just expect everything to be equal between them. And that there are a lot of assumptions for me to get to that point. So I'm trying to think, okay, what is West assuming when West says that because half of these returned appliances were inspected by Haynes, therefore Haynes is clearly the worst? Well, assuming that more than his fair share of appliances had defects in them that he didn't find, right? Because they ended up going to customers. All right, so Young's response is, but Haynes inspects significantly more than half of the appliances we sell each year. Okay, so now Young is saying, hey, wait a second, like, you're assuming that each of the quality control inspectors inspects the same number of appliances, and therefore it, shows that Haynes is bad, that so many more of the appliances he inspected had defects in them that he missed. But here we see that it could just be because Haynes inspects way more than the other quality control inspectors. All right, so A, Young responds by contending that the argument presupposes what it's trying to prove. Does it presuppose what it's trying to prove? No, actually, that's not what Young does, right? So Young doesn't say, well, you're just assuming that Haynes is the worst. You don't have any evidence to show that Haynes is the worst. Young actually goes deeper than that, right? And rejects an assumption that West is making within his argument, right? So like he does make an argument, he does have evidence. It's just that he can't really like interpret that evidence correctly without looking at the assumptions that he's made and actually checking the numbers, right? B, questioning the relevance of West's conclusion. Nope, doesn't say like, why do we care that Haynes is the worst? Why does it matter? Nope. I'm not doing that. C, disputing the accuracy of one of the argument's stated premises. So the argument never states that Haynes inspects a certain amount of appliances each year. It's referring to the number of appliances that are returned that were inspected by Haynes, rather than like what percentage of the total appliances sold does Haynes inspect. So this one, it's not actually a dispute of a stated premise. It's disputing an assumption underlying West's argument, which is the assumption that all of the quality control inspectors inspect the same number of the total appliances that are sold. D, arguing for a less extreme version of West's conclusion. No. So arguing for a less extreme version would be maybe arguing that Haynes is like worse than some quality control inspectors rather than like the worst, but that's not what Young is doing. Denying one of the argument's presuppositions. Yeah, so the presupposition that they're talking about, the assumption that they're talking about is the assumption that each of these three quality control inspectors inspects like 1/3 of the total, and therefore there's like a disproportionate number of defects that Haynes is missing because half of the ones that come back were inspected by Haynes, but it's not disproportionate if Haynes inspects significantly more than half of the appliances sold each year. So that's what Young is attacking. Yeah, tough question. Okay. And then the last one, also from 79, section 222. So 79, get back in there. 222, last one. All right, which of the following most accurately describes the role played in the consumer advocate's argument by the claim that willingness to pay is not proportional to need? Okay, where do we see that? Willingness to pay here. And the word but, so it's in contrast to something. Okay. So let's figure out what it's in contrast to, how it works with the rest of the parts of the argument. Consumer advocate says that economists reason that, and here we have some people say, economists reason, that's equivalent to that phrase some people say. Economists reason that price gouging, increasing the price of goods when no alternative seller is available, is efficient because it allocates goods to people whose willingness to pay more shows that they really need those goods. But willingness to pay is not proportional to need. All right. So economists have come to this conclusion, right, that price gouging is efficient because it allocates goods to people whose willingness to pay more shows that they really need those goods. So this statement is kind of calling into question the evidence that the economists have for their conclusion. Do the economists say that willingness to pay is proportional to need? Not really, right? They do say that willingness to pay more shows that you do need the goods, but not that like there's proportionality there necessarily. So that doesn't quite say that, right? So when we respond to an argument, sometimes we might be responding to an interpretation or an assumption that we're making, thinking that that's what they've said. And so we've got to be careful about that and just recognize that like the economists didn't necessarily say there's proportionality just because paying more means you really need those goods. That's not quite proportionality. Proportionality is that willingness to pay more shows that you need those goods more. Like the comparison has to keep going up, and so just being a little bit careful that that's not quite what the economists have claimed. In the real world, some people simply cannot pay as much as others. As a result, a price increase will allocate goods to the people with the most money, not those with the most need. Yeah, so they're going after, certainly going after the evidence and the reasoning behind the economists' argument. All right. A, it disputes one explanation in order to make way for an alternative explanation. No, so we don't really have making way for an alternative explanation. And I don't see this so much as an explanation, rather like an argument that price gouging is efficient. It kind of explains why it's efficient, but we're not giving an alternative explanation for that conclusion. Is it the overall conclusion? No. A component of reasoning disputed? No, it goes against the reasoning that the economists have, which is the reasoning being disputed. It's a general principle whose validity the argument questions. No, the argument doesn't question this. The argument is offering this, is like making this claim. It denies a claim that the argument takes to be assumed in the reasoning that it rejects. Yes, it does. So it's saying willingness to pay is not proportional to need. The argument is taking that as being assumed by the economists, and the economist reasoning is the reasoning that it rejects. So it's denying this claim, which they think is assumed by the economists in their reasoning about price gouging. So that's it for that's it for me for these structure questions. If you have any more that you'd like to send me, please feel free. Have a good one.